59. Baby witnessed mother bear, communicating with trees to find lost children. Everyone was shocked before moving into the story. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning mist hung heavy between the towering pines, creating a world that seemed suspended between dream and reality. Ethan Marshall adjusted the straps of his backpack, feeling the familiar weight of his ranger equipment against his shoulders. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily Morgan, walked beside him, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the rough bark of passing trees. They had done this walk 100 times before, but today something felt different. The forest held a peculiar stillness, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping woodland, but something more expectant, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ethan had been a park ranger for 15 years, and he had learned to trust these subtle feelings, these whispers from the wild that spoke to those who knew how to listen. The path beneath their feet was soft with pine needles, cushioning each step with a gentle give that made their movement almost soundless. Lily had insisted on coming with him this morning, something about a dream she had where the trees were singing, and though Ethan usually kept his patrol routes separate from family time, something had made him say yes. Perhaps it was the earnest look in her eyes, or maybe it was that same strange feeling that now made the hair on his arms stand on end despite the warm morning air. The ancient forest stretched endlessly around them, each tree a monument to centuries of silent growth. Some of these giants had been standing when Ethan's great-grandfather had first settled in these parts, and they would likely still be standing long after his own grandchildren had grown old. There was something humbling about walking among such ancient life, something that made human concerns seem small and temporary. Ethan pointed out different bird calls to Lily as they walked, teaching her the difference between the sharp cry of a hawk and the melodic trill of a wood thrush. She absorbed everything with the intense concentration only children possess, her eyes bright with wonder at each new discovery. The morning sun filtered through the canopy in long, golden shafts, creating pools of light that danced across the forest floor as the branches swayed gently overhead. In these moments of shared discovery, Ethan felt the deep satisfaction of passing on his love for the wild places to the next generation. He remembered his own father doing the same, teaching him to read the forest like a book, to understand its rhythms and respect its mysteries. They had been walking for nearly an hour when the atmosphere shifted. The bird songs that had accompanied their journey suddenly ceased, leaving only the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Ethan instinctively moved closer to Lily, his trained senses alert to any potential danger. Years of experience had taught him that sudden silence in the forest usually meant a predator was near, and his hand moved automatically to the bear spray on his belt. But what they encountered next was not what he expected. Through the trees ahead, near the crystal-clear stream that wound through this section of the forest, a large shape moved with obvious distress. As they drew closer, keeping themselves partially hidden behind a cluster of thick trunks, Ethan recognized the distinctive hump and powerful build of a mother black bear. She was pacing back and forth along the stream bank, her movements agitated and purposeful, occasionally rising on her hind legs to look around, before dropping back down with a heavy thud that they could feel through the ground. The bear's behavior immediately told Ethan something was terribly wrong. In all his years working these woods, he had seen bears in many situations, but this frantic energy, this visible anxiety, was something that transcended species barriers. The mother bear would take a few steps in one direction, stop, sniff the air desperately, then turn and repeat the process in another direction. Low, mournful sounds emanated from her throat. Not quite growls, not quite whimpers, but something in between that spoke of a deep, primal distress. Ethan knew immediately what had happened. Her cubs were missing. The realization hit him with unexpected force, and he found himself gripping Lily's shoulder protectively while simultaneously feeling a wave of empathy for the distraught animal before them. A mother's love, a parent's fear for their children. These were universal truths that needed no translation between species. He had seen this same panic in human parents who had lost children in the park. The same desperate energy, the same refusal to stop searching even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Lily pressed close to his side, her voice barely a whisper when she spoke. She asked if the bear was sad, and Ethan nodded, explaining quietly that the mother had lost her babies and was looking for them. He could see the immediate understanding and sympathy in his daughter's eyes, the same emotional connection that made her rescue injured butterflies and build tiny hospitals for wounded beetles in their backyard. The bear continued her desperate search pattern, occasionally stopping to smell specific spots on the ground or to examine disturbed leaves with an intensity that was both methodical and frantic. Ethan knew he should report this situation immediately. Protocol dictated that he radio in any significant wildlife behavior, especially concerning bears, as lost cubs could mean they might wander into populated areas or encounter dangers they were too young to handle. But something held him back, some instinct that told him to wait, to watch, to witness whatever was about to unfold. The mother bear's search had taken her in widening circles from the stream, each loop bringing her closer to where Ethan and Lily crouched in their hiding spot. He could see her more clearly now, could observe the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she processed information from multiple senses simultaneously. Her nose worked constantly, testing the air for any trace of her cub's scent. Her ears swiveled independently, catching sounds too faint for human perception. Every few moments she would pause and release a specific call, a sound Ethan had heard mother bears use to summon their young, a mixture of a grunt and a moan that carried surprisingly far through the forest. But no answering calls came back, no rustling of small bodies through the underbrush, no sign of the cubs she sought so desperately. The silence that followed each call seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive, as if the forest itself shared in the mother's growing despair. As they watched, Ethan noticed something unusual about the bear's behavior. Between her frantic searching, she would occasionally stop and look at the trees around her, not in the casual way bears usually surveyed their environment, but with what seemed like deliberate attention. She would approach certain trees, usually the oldest and largest ones, and pause before them as if considering something. At first, Ethan thought she might be looking for claw marks or other signs her cubs might have left, but there was something different about these pauses, something that seemed less like searching and more like contemplating. He shook his head at the thought. Years of scientific training told him he was anthropomorphizing, projecting human behaviors onto an animal. But still, there was something about the way the bear regarded those ancient trees that made him wonder if there was more happening here than met the eye. The forest around them had taken on an almost expectant quality. Even the ever-present insects had quieted their buzzing, and the leaves overhead had stilled despite the morning breeze that should have been stirring them. Ethan felt Lily's hand slip into his, her small fingers gripping tightly as they both watched the drama unfolding before them. He thought about all the people around the world who loved stories about nature, about the mysterious connections between animals and their environment, and he wished he could share this moment with them. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, he thought to himself, you would understand the power of this moment, the way nature can surprise us even when we think we know it well. Don't forget to share your own experiences with wildlife, to celebrate these connections that remind us we're all part of something larger. The bear had now moved to the edge of the small clearing, where a grove of particularly ancient trees stood like sentinels. These were trees that had been old when the first settlers arrived, their trunks so thick that it would take 4 or 5 people holding hands to encircle them. What happened next challenged everything Ethan thought he knew about animal behavior. The mother bear approached the largest of these ancient trees with a deliberation that was entirely different from her earlier frantic searching. She placed her massive front paws against the bark, almost gently, as if greeting an old friend. Then she moved to the next tree and repeated the gesture, and then the next, creating a semicircle of touched trees. Ethan held his breath, certain that any sound might break whatever spell was being woven before them. The bear sat back on her haunches in the center of the semicircle she had created, and then she did something that sent chills down Ethan's spine. She began to produce a sound unlike anything he had ever heard from a bear before. It started as a low rumble, so deep that he felt it more than heard it, vibrating through the ground and up into his chest. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed deliberate and meaningful. Lily's grip on his hand tightened as the humming continued, and Ethan found himself unable to look away from the scene before them. The bear's eyes were closed now, her entire body swaying slightly with the rhythm of her strange song. The sound seemed to penetrate everything around them, seeping into the bark of the trees, traveling through the root systems beneath their feet, filling the air with a frequency that made Ethan's skin tingle. He had studied animal communication extensively as part of his training, had read about the complex vocalizations of wolves, the intricate dances of bees, the sophisticated echolocation of bats. But this was something entirely different, something that seemed to transcend simple communication and enter the realm of— he didn't even have words for what he was witnessing. As the bear's humming continued, Ethan became aware of subtle changes in their surroundings. The air current, which had been still and stagnant, began to move with purpose, flowing from the grove of ancient trees toward a specific direction deeper in the forest. It wasn't a strong wind, just a gentle but persistent breeze that seemed to follow a path as deliberate as a river following its bed. The leaves on certain branches began to rustle, while others remained perfectly still, creating a pattern of movement that drew the eye along a particular route through the trees. Even more remarkably, birds that had been silent began to call, but not randomly. The calls seemed to echo from specific locations, creating an auditory trail that led in the same direction as the wind. A woodpecker's rhythmic tapping started from a tree to their left, was answered by another further along, then another even further, like a Morse code message being relayed through the forest. Ethan's scientific mind raced to find explanations for what he was seeing. Coincidence? It had to be coincidence. The wind was simply following natural air currents. The birds were responding to the bear's presence in normal, territorial displays. The rustling leaves were caused by variations in air pressure. But even as he tried to rationalize what was happening, he knew these explanations fell short. There was an intelligence to the patterns, a purposefulness that defied random chance. The bear had stopped her humming now and was standing perfectly still, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, with a sudden decisiveness, she began to move, following the exact path indicated by the wind, the leaves, and the bird calls. She didn't run, didn't show the frantic energy of before, but moved with confident purpose as if following a map only she could see. Without conscious thought, Ethan found himself following, keeping Lily close beside him as they maintained a safe distance from the bear. His ranger training screamed at him that this was dangerous, that following a distressed mother bear deeper into the forest violated every safety protocol he had been taught. But something stronger than training compelled him forward, a need to understand what he had just witnessed, to follow this mystery to its conclusion. They moved as quietly as possible, though Ethan suspected the bear knew exactly where they were. Occasionally, she would pause and look back in their direction, but there was no aggression in her posture, almost as if she accepted their presence as witnesses to whatever was unfolding. The path they followed was not random. Ethan realized the bear was being led along an old game trail he knew well, one that wound through some of the most ancient parts of the forest. But there were subtle deviations from the usual route. At certain forks in the trail, a particular tree would creak despite no wind touching it, or a shower of pine needles would fall from a specific direction, and the bear would adjust her course accordingly. It was as if the forest itself was providing directions, guiding the mother bear through some form of communication that operated outside normal human perception. Ethan thought of all the indigenous stories he had heard about these woods, tales of trees that held wisdom, of forests that were alive in ways science couldn't measure. He had always respected these stories as cultural heritage, but had never considered them as literal truth. Now, watching this impossible navigation system in action, he wondered if perhaps there were forms of knowledge that his scientific training had taught him to dismiss too quickly. Lily had been silent throughout their pursuit, but Ethan could feel her excitement and wonder through the way she moved, alert and engaged with everything around them. She seemed to accept what they were seeing more easily than he did, perhaps because children hadn't yet learned what was supposed to be impossible. When a butterfly landed on a flower directly in the bear's path, causing her to alter course slightly, Lily simply nodded as if this made perfect sense. When a pattern of sunlight through the leaves seemed to illuminate specific spots on the ground that the bear then stepped on precisely, his daughter showed no surprise. There was a lesson in that acceptance, Ethan thought. A reminder that sometimes wonder was more valuable than understanding, that mystery could be more truthful than explanation. They had been following for nearly 20 minutes when the forest began to change around them. The trees grew even larger if that was possible, their trunks taking on the gnarled, twisted character of truly ancient growth. The underbrush thinned out, creating a more open forest floor carpeted with centuries of fallen needles. The light here was different too, filtered through so many layers of branches that it took on an almost green quality, like being underwater. Ethan recognized this part of the forest as one of the last remaining stands of old-growth timber, trees that had never been logged, never been touched by modern development. It was a place that felt older than memory, older than human history, a fragment of the world as it had been before humans had learned to reshape it to their needs. The bear's pace had quickened slightly, and Ethan could sense a change in her energy. Where before there had been desperation and worry, now there was something like anticipation, even hope. The forest's guidance seemed to intensify as well. Birds flew overhead in the direction they were traveling, their wing beats creating a rhythm that matched the bear's stride. Squirrels chattered from tree to tree, their path parallel to the one on the ground. Even the insects seemed to participate, clouds of gnats forming and dispersing in patterns that always pointed forward, deeper into the ancient grove. It was as if every living thing in this part of the forest was participating in a single, coordinated effort to reunite the mother with her cubs. As they continued deeper into the old-growth forest, Ethan began to notice more subtle signs of the forest's involvement in their journey. Certain trees seemed to lean slightly in the direction they were meant to travel, their branches creating natural arrows pointing the way. Patches of mushrooms grew in formations that resembled directional markers, and even the way the light fell through the canopy seemed designed to illuminate their path while leaving the surrounding forest in shadow. He thought about all the times he had walked these woods, believing he understood them, believing that his scientific training had given him insight into how this ecosystem functioned. But now he realized he had been seeing only the surface, the measurable and quantifiable aspects, while missing the deeper connections that bound everything together in ways that transcended simple biological interactions. The mother bear suddenly stopped, her entire body going rigid with attention. She had heard something, caught some signal that Ethan's human senses couldn't detect. She released a low call, different from the desperate sounds she had been making earlier, this one full of question and hope. And then, from somewhere ahead, came an answer. It was faint, barely audible even in the profound quiet of the old growth forest, but it was unmistakably the cry of a bear cub. The mother's reaction was immediate and powerful. She surged forward, not running exactly, but moving with a purposeful speed that showed her confidence in where she was going. Ethan and Lily followed as quickly as they could while still maintaining their distance, both of them caught up in the emotional moment of impending reunion. But as they crested a small rise and saw what lay ahead, Ethan stopped short, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. There, in a small natural clearing surrounded by the most ancient trees he had ever seen, were indeed 2 bear cubs, but they were not alone, not lost, not in any apparent distress. Instead, they were calmly following another bear, an elderly female by the look of her graying muzzle and the careful way she moved. The cubs showed no fear of this older bear, no signs of the panic young animals typically displayed when separated from their mother. They were simply walking with her, occasionally stopping to investigate something she pointed out with her nose, learning from her in the way cubs learned from their mothers. But this wasn't their mother, and the realization that the cubs had not been lost at all, but had been deliberately led away, added an entirely new dimension to the mystery. The elderly bear looked up as the mother approached, and Ethan witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The 2 adult bears regarded each other with what could only be described as recognition and understanding. There was no aggression, no territorial display, none of the behaviors Ethan would have expected when 2 adult bears met. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like communication, an exchange of looks and subtle body language that seemed to convey complex information. The cubs, seeing their mother, bounded toward her with obvious joy, but even their reunion seemed somehow expected, as if this had all been part of some plan Ethan couldn't fathom. The mother bear nuzzled her cubs, checking them over with the thorough attention of any parent reunited with their children, but her attention kept returning to the elderly bear, and there was something in her posture that suggested gratitude, or perhaps respect. The elderly bear moved slowly toward one of the massive trees at the edge of the clearing and placed her paw against it, just as the mother had done earlier. She made a similar low humming sound, though hers was quieter, more subtle, like an echo of the mother's earlier call. The tree impossibly seemed to respond. A shower of pine needles fell from its branches, not randomly but in a deliberate pattern that created a clear line on the forest floor. The line pointed toward a section of the forest Ethan knew well, an area where a recent geological survey had indicated unstable ground, though no official warnings had been issued yet. The elderly bear followed the line with her eyes, then looked back at the mother bear with what seemed like urgent communication. The mother bear gathered her cubs closer, her body language shifting from relief to a new kind of alertness. It was then that Ethan understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at intuition. The cubs hadn't been lost. They had been deliberately moved, guided away from some danger that the elderly bear, perhaps through her connection with the forest itself, had sensed coming. The mother's distress had been real, but the forest had responded not by simply showing her where her cubs were, but by explaining why they had been moved, what danger they had been saved from. He thought of the unstable ground the survey had found, of the potential for landslides in that area, of how animals often sensed geological changes before humans could detect them. But this was more than simple instinct. This was coordinated action, communication across species, a level of cooperation that suggested the forest was not just a collection of individual organisms, but something more integrated, more conscious than he had ever imagined. The bears began to move again, the elderly female leading the way with the mother and cubs following. They were heading away from the unstable area, toward safer ground deeper in the old growth forest. Ethan knew he should report this, should document what he had seen, but he also knew that no one would believe him. How could he explain that he had witnessed bears communicating with trees, that the forest itself had orchestrated a rescue operation? It would sound like fantasy, like the anthropomorphization his training had warned him against. But Lily's hand in his, warm and trusting, reminded him that not everything needed to be explained to be true, that sometimes the most important experiences were the ones that couldn't be reduced to data and reports. As they watched the bears disappear into the deeper forest, Ethan felt a fundamental shift in his understanding of the world he thought he knew so well. The forest around him no longer seemed like a collection of separate organisms competing for resources, but like a single, vast entity with its own form of consciousness, its own ways of protecting and nurturing the life within it. He thought of the mycorrhizal networks scientists had discovered, the underground fungal webs that connected trees and allowed them to share nutrients and information. Perhaps what he had witnessed was an extension of that network, a form of communication that included not just trees, but all the forest's inhabitants in ways science was only beginning to glimpse. The morning sun was climbing higher now, penetrating even the thick canopy of the old-growth forest, and the normal sounds of forest life were slowly returning. But nothing would ever be quite normal for Ethan again. As he and Lily began their walk back to the ranger station, he found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The way certain trees seemed to lean toward each other as if in conversation. The patterns birds made as they flew between branches. The deliberate paths insects took across the forest floor. Everything seemed connected by invisible threads of communication and purpose, a vast network of relationships that operated on principles beyond human understanding. Lily walked beside him in comfortable silence, occasionally reaching out to touch a tree trunk or observe a butterfly, and Ethan realized she had understood all along what he was only beginning to grasp. Children, perhaps, were better equipped to accept the mysteries of the natural world without needing to dissect and categorize them. The journey back seemed shorter than the journey out, as if the forest was easing their passage now that they had been initiated into its secrets. Ethan found himself wondering how many other rangers, how many other people who spent their lives in wild places, had witnessed similar events but never spoke of them for fear of being disbelieved. He thought of indigenous peoples who had always spoken of the forest as a living entity, of their stories that described trees as ancestors and animals as relatives. Perhaps their worldview wasn't metaphorical but literal, based on observations accumulated over thousands of years of living in harmony with these wild places. Western science, for all its achievements, had perhaps lost something essential in its rush to quantify and categorize, had forgotten that some truths could only be experienced, not measured. As the ranger station came into view through the trees, Ethan made a decision. He would file his report as required, but he would leave out the extraordinary events he had witnessed. He would simply note that he had observed a mother bear successfully reunited with her cubs, that all animals appeared healthy, and that they had moved away from an area of potential geological instability. The facts without the mystery, the outcome without the magic. But he would remember, and he would return to that grove of ancient trees, would spend more time listening to the subtle communications of the forest. Perhaps, over time, he might learn to understand even a fraction of the language he had witnessed today, might become a translator between the human world and the older, deeper wisdom of the wild. That evening, as Ethan tucked Lily into bed, she asked him if the trees really could talk to the animals. He thought carefully before answering, choosing his words with the same deliberation the forest had shown in guiding the bear. He told her that there were many ways of talking that didn't use words, that the forest had its own language made of wind and growth, of chemical signals and underground networks, of relationships built over centuries. He told her that science was only beginning to understand these connections, but that didn't mean they hadn't always existed. She nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the easy faith of childhood, then asked if he thought the mother bear would teach her cubs to talk to the trees. Ethan smiled and said he was certain she would, that it was probably a knowledge passed down through generations of bears, just as he was passing down his love of the forest to her. Later, sitting on his porch and looking out at the forest that stretched endlessly beyond his small human settlement, Ethan reflected on the day's events. He thought about all the people around the world who would never believe what he had seen, but also about those who would understand immediately, who had perhaps witnessed similar mysteries in their own encounters with the natural world. The forest was full of secrets, he realized, secrets that revealed themselves only to those who approached with respect and openness, who were willing to accept that human understanding was limited and that nature operated on principles far older and more complex than anything in our textbooks. The sound of wind through trees reached him, and for the first time he wondered if it might be more than just wind, if it might be the forest itself breathing, speaking, living in ways we were only beginning to imagine. The second chapter began 3 days later, though for Ethan, those 3 days had felt like 3 years. He had returned to his normal routine, filing reports, conducting surveys, leading the occasional tour group through the marked trails of the park. But his mind kept returning to that morning in the old-growth forest, to the impossible thing he had witnessed. He found himself pausing at random moments, listening to the forest with new attention, wondering if he might catch another glimpse of that hidden communication network. His colleagues noticed his distraction but attributed it to the long hours and the stress of the job. Only Lily knew the real reason for his preoccupation, and she had taken to spending more time outdoors, sitting quietly near trees and whispering to them in the serious way children did when they believed something completely. On this particular morning, Ethan had risen before dawn, unable to sleep, drawn by an irresistible need to return to the place where his understanding of the world had changed. He left a note for his wife, grabbed his gear, and headed into the forest while the stars were still visible through gaps in the canopy. The pre-dawn forest was a different world from its daytime counterpart, full of nocturnal creatures finishing their hunts and diurnal animals just beginning to stir. He moved carefully through the darkness, his flashlight creating a small bubble of visibility in the vast black ocean of trees. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, only that he needed to be there, needed to understand more about what he had witnessed. As he approached the grove of ancient trees where the mother bear had first made her strange communication, Ethan turned off his flashlight and let his eyes adjust to the darkness. Slowly, the forest revealed itself in shades of gray and black, illuminated only by the faint starlight that managed to penetrate the canopy. He found a comfortable position against one of the giant trunks and settled in to wait for sunrise, to observe, to listen. The bark against his back was rough and deeply grooved, and he found himself wondering how many centuries of growth had created these patterns, how many storms and seasons this tree had weathered. In the darkness, with his vision limited, his other senses seemed to sharpen. He could hear the tiny feet of mice moving through the leaf litter, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak and groan of branches adjusting to temperature changes. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Ethan became aware of a subtle change in the forest's rhythm. It was nothing dramatic, nothing as obvious as what he had witnessed with the bears, but there was definitely something happening. The trees around him seemed to be waking up, not in any visible way, but in some deeper sense that he could feel rather than observe. He remembered reading about how trees moved water from their roots to their crowns, how this process accelerated with sunrise, and wondered if what he was sensing was this massive hydraulic system coming online. But it felt like more than just physical processes. There was an alertness to it, an awareness that suggested consciousness of some kind, even if it was a consciousness completely alien to human experience. A movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention, and Ethan slowly turned his head to see a deer stepping delicately into the grove. It was a doe, mature and healthy, moving with the careful grace of her species. But there was something different about her behavior. Instead of browsing on the low vegetation as deer typically did at this hour, she approached one of the ancient trees and stood before it, her head raised, her ears focused forward. She stayed in that position for several long moments, so still she might have been a statue, then suddenly turned and moved decisively toward a different part of the forest. Ethan watched her go, noting the purposefulness of her movement, the way she seemed to be following a specific route rather than wandering in search of food. Curiosity overcoming caution, Ethan rose from his position and followed the deer's path. He moved as quietly as his human feet allowed, staying far enough back to avoid startling her but close enough to keep her in sight. The doe led him through parts of the forest he knew well, but she took routes he had never noticed before, natural corridors between trees that created almost tunnel-like passages through the undergrowth. As they traveled, Ethan began to notice other animals moving in the same general direction. A family of raccoons crossed their path, heading the same way. Birds flew overhead in small groups, all following the same trajectory. Even a typically solitary fox appeared briefly, trotting purposefully along a parallel path. This coordinated movement of different species was unusual enough to make Ethan's scientific training kick in. He tried to think of natural explanations for what he was seeing. Perhaps there was a water source that had recently become available, or a food source that multiple species could exploit. Maybe there was a predator in another part of the forest that they were all avoiding. But none of these explanations quite fit the behavior he was observing. The animals weren't fleeing, weren't showing signs of fear or urgency. They were simply moving with shared purpose toward some common destination. And more mysteriously, they seemed to be following routes that had been somehow communicated to them, as if they had all received the same set of directions. The doe eventually led him to another clearing, this one smaller than where he had seen the bears, but equally surrounded by ancient trees. Here, Ethan witnessed something that made him question whether he was still asleep, lost in some vivid dream. Animals had gathered in the clearing, not just one or two, but dozens of different species, all maintaining a respectful distance from each other but clearly there for the same purpose. Deer stood beside wild turkeys, raccoons sat near possums, and even a black bear, possibly the same mother he had seen days ago, was present with her cubs. They were all facing the same direction, toward the largest tree at the far end of the clearing, and they were all perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Ethan found a concealed position behind a cluster of younger trees and watched, barely daring to breathe. The sun had risen enough now to send its first direct rays into the clearing, and as the light touched the great tree that seemed to be the focus of attention, something extraordinary happened. The tree began to hum. It was the same deep, resonant sound the mother bear had made, but this time it was coming from the tree itself. Ethan could feel the vibration through the ground, could see the leaves trembling despite the absence of any wind. The sound seemed to emerge from the very wood of the tree, as if its centuries of growth had been building toward this moment of expression. The gathered animals remained motionless, but Ethan could sense their attention intensifying, could almost feel them listening with every fiber of their being. The humming continued for several minutes, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost like language, like sentences and paragraphs of meaning encoded in vibration. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. For a moment, nothing moved in the clearing. Then, as if released from a spell, the animals began to disperse. But their dispersal wasn't random or chaotic. Each species, each individual, moved with obvious purpose in specific directions. The deer headed toward the eastern section of the forest, the raccoons toward the creek. The birds took flight in coordinated groups toward different compass points. Within minutes, the clearing was empty except for Ethan, who remained hidden, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. He stayed in his hiding spot for a long time, trying to process what he had seen. The tree had communicated something to those animals, had passed on information that they had all understood despite being different species with different cognitive capabilities. It was as if the tree served as some kind of central communication hub, translating and transmitting information in a way that each species could comprehend. Ethan thought of the underground fungal networks again, of the research showing that trees could share resources and information through these networks. But this was beyond anything suggested by that research. This was active, deliberate communication across not just species but entire kingdoms of life. As the morning progressed and normal forest sounds returned, Ethan finally emerged from his hiding spot and approached the great tree. Up close, it was even more impressive than from a distance. The trunk was so wide it would have taken a dozen people to encircle it, and the bark was deeply furrowed in patterns that looked almost like a written language. He placed his hand against the bark, half expecting to feel some residual vibration from the morning's communication, but there was nothing unusual, just the rough texture of ancient wood. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was aware of him, that it knew he had witnessed its morning gathering, and was perhaps evaluating him, deciding whether this human could be trusted with the forest's secrets. Ethan spent the rest of the morning exploring the area around the clearing, looking for any physical evidence of what he had witnessed. He found game trails that all seemed to converge on this spot, worn paths that suggested this gathering was not a one-time event but something that happened regularly. He noticed that the trees immediately surrounding the clearing were all of similar ancient age, as if they had been deliberately preserved while younger forest grew up around them. There were other subtle signs, too, arrangements of rocks that seemed too deliberate to be natural, patterns in the way certain plants grew that suggested cultivation, or at least encouragement. It was as if this clearing was a designated meeting place, a forum where the forest's business was conducted. As the sun climbed toward noon, Ethan reluctantly began his journey back to the ranger station. He had a tour group scheduled for the afternoon, a bunch of school children eager to learn about forest ecology. As he walked, he wondered how he could possibly teach them about the forest now, knowing what he knew. How could he explain photosynthesis and food chains and habitat zones when he had witnessed something that suggested the forest operated on principles far more complex than anything in their textbooks? But then he thought of Lily, of her easy acceptance of mystery, and realized that perhaps children were the perfect audience for these deeper truths. They hadn't yet learned to dismiss the impossible, hadn't yet been taught that consciousness was limited to animals with certain types of brains. The tour that afternoon was unlike any Ethan had ever given. He still covered the required educational points, still explained the scientific facts about trees and animals and ecosystems, but he also told stories, carefully framed as indigenous legends and folklore, about forests that could think and communicate, about trees that held councils and made decisions, about animals that could understand the language of wood and leaf. The children listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed they understood these stories might be more than just myths. One particularly bright girl asked if trees could really talk to each other, and Ethan told her about mycorrhizal networks, about chemical signals, about the scientific discoveries that were beginning to confirm what people had long believed. But he also told her to listen with more than her ears, to pay attention to the subtle signs and patterns in nature, to keep her mind open to possibilities that science hadn't yet learned to measure. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk, trying to write up his observations from the morning. He had decided to keep a personal journal of these experiences, separate from his official reports. If he couldn't share them through proper channels, at least he could document them for himself. And perhaps someday, when science had advanced enough to take such observations seriously, his notes might contribute to a broader understanding of forest consciousness. He wrote about the gathering in the clearing, about the trees' humming communication, about the coordinated response of different species. He tried to be as objective and detailed as possible, recording times and locations, species present, specific behaviors observed. But he also allowed himself to speculate, to theorize about what mechanisms might allow such communication, what evolutionary advantages might have led to this level of interspecies cooperation. As he wrote, Ethan found himself thinking about the implications of what he had witnessed. If forests could communicate and coordinate at this level, if trees could serve as information hubs for entire ecosystems, then human understanding of nature was fundamentally incomplete. We had been studying forests as collections of competing individuals, missing the cooperative network that bound everything together. It was like studying human society by only looking at individual people, never noticing the languages, cultures, and institutions that allowed them to function as a civilization. The forest had its own civilization, its own ways of making collective decisions and responding to threats, its own methods of education and information transfer. The thought was both humbling and exciting. Humbling because it showed how little humans really understood about the natural world despite centuries of scientific study. Exciting because it suggested there were still profound mysteries to uncover, still fundamental discoveries to be made. Ethan thought about all the forests being clear-cut around the world and wondered what ancient communication networks were being destroyed, what accumulated wisdom was being lost. If trees could hold and transmit information, if they could coordinate ecosystem-wide responses to threats, then every old-growth forest that disappeared took with it irreplaceable knowledge, libraries of experience encoded in wood and root and fungal networks. Over the following weeks, Ethan returned to the clearing whenever he could, sometimes witnessing gatherings, sometimes finding it empty. He began to notice patterns in when animals would congregate there. It often happened before weather changes, before seasonal transitions, or when there were disturbances in other parts of the forest. It was as if the clearing served as an emergency broadcast system, a way for the forest to rapidly disseminate important information to all its inhabitants. He also noticed that not all trees seemed capable of the humming communication. It was always the oldest, largest trees that served as transmitters, suggesting that this ability developed over centuries or perhaps millennia of growth. One morning, about a month after his first observation, Ethan arrived at the clearing to find it fuller than he had ever seen it. Not just the usual local animals were present, but creatures he rarely saw in this part of the forest. There were animals that typically lived miles away, species that must have traveled all night to reach this gathering. The atmosphere was different, too, charged with the tension he could feel in the air. When the great tree began its humming communication, the sound was more urgent than before, the vibrations stronger and more insistent. The message, whatever it was, seemed to be of critical importance. After the gathering dispersed, Ethan noticed that many animals were moving in the same direction, toward the lower elevations of the forest. He followed at a distance, his concern growing as he realized they were evacuating from something. It wasn't until 3 days later that he understood what the forest had been warning about. A massive storm system, one that hadn't been on any weather forecast, swept through the region. The higher elevations, where many of the animals had lived, were devastated by flooding and landslides. But casualties among the wildlife were remarkably low, because they had already moved to safety, warned by a communication system that had detected the approaching danger long before human meteorology. Standing in the aftermath of the storm, surveying the damage, while knowing that the forest's inhabitants were largely safe, Ethan felt a profound shift in his worldview. The forest wasn't just alive, it was intelligent, capable of predictive analysis and coordinated response. It could sense changes that human technology couldn't detect, could mobilize its inhabitants with an efficiency that human emergency management could only dream of. The indigenous peoples had been right all along. The forest was a teacher, a protector, a conscious entity that cared for those who lived within it. Science was only now beginning to develop the tools and concepts to understand what had always been known by those who listened closely to the natural world. As he helped with the storm cleanup over the following days, Ethan found himself sharing his observations with a few trusted colleagues. To his surprise, several of them had their own stories, their own encounters with inexplicable forest phenomena that they had never reported for fear of professional ridicule. One had seen trees seem to shepherd a lost child back toward safety. Another had observed what appeared to be coordinated hunting behaviors between typically non-cooperative species. A third had noticed that certain trees always seemed to fall in ways that created bridges across streams, too consistently to be coincidence. Together, they began to compile their observations, to look for patterns and commonalities, to build a body of evidence that might eventually lead to formal recognition of forest consciousness. The work was slow and often frustrating. Traditional science demanded reproducible experiments, controlled conditions, measurable results. But how could you create controlled conditions for something as vast and complex as forest consciousness? How could you measure communication that operated on timescales of seasons and centuries? How could you reproduce observations of events that might happen only when specific conditions aligned? It was like trying to prove human consciousness existed by studying individual neurons, missing the emergent properties that arose from their collective action. But Ethan and his colleagues persisted, knowing that paradigm shifts in science often began with observations that didn't fit existing theories, with mysteries that demanded new ways of thinking. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his own education in the forest's language. He learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded gatherings at the clearing. A certain quality of stillness in the air, a particular pattern in bird movements, a way the light seemed to focus on the ancient trees. He began to understand that the humming communication was just one channel among many, that the forest communicated through chemical signals, through electromagnetic fields, through vibrations in the soil, through patterns of growth and decay. It was a language that used every possible medium, a symphony of information that required all senses, and perhaps some humans didn't possess to fully comprehend. One evening, as he sat with Lily on their porch, she asked him if he thought humans would ever be able to talk to trees the way the bears did. Ethan considered the question carefully. He told her that humans had been talking to trees for thousands of years, in prayers and songs and stories. The difference was that most modern humans had forgotten how to listen for answers. But he believed that was changing, that science and ancient wisdom were beginning to converge, that we were rediscovering our place in the conversation of the natural world. Lily nodded thoughtfully, then said she was going to keep practicing, keep listening, because maybe the trees were just waiting for humans to remember how to hear them. As summer turned to autumn, Ethan watched the forest prepare for winter with new appreciation for the coordination involved. The timing of leaf fall, the storage of nutrients, the migration patterns of birds, the hibernation preparations of mammals, all of it seemed orchestrated by the invisible communication network he had glimpsed. He thought of the mother bear and her cubs, wondered if they were learning to interpret the forest's signals, if they were being taught the ancient knowledge that would help them survive and thrive. He thought of the elderly bear who had guided them to safety, and wondered how many generations of accumulated wisdom she represented, how many seasons of listening to the forest's voice. The scientific community remained skeptical of Ethan's informal research, but he found unexpected allies in other fields. Philosophers interested in consciousness studies, indigenous scholars documenting traditional ecological knowledge, even some physicists exploring quantum entanglement and information theory. They all brought different perspectives to the question of forest consciousness, different frameworks for understanding how information might move through living systems in ways that transcended conventional biology. Slowly, a new interdisciplinary field began to emerge, one that took seriously the possibility that consciousness might not be limited to brains, that intelligence might arise from any sufficiently complex network of interactions. One day in late autumn, Ethan received a call from a colleague at a university research station. They had been conducting long-term studies of tree communication through chemical signals and had discovered something remarkable. The trees in their study area appeared to be sending coordinated messages about Ethan himself. Whenever he entered certain parts of the forest, chemical signatures that seemed to identify him specifically would propagate through the mycorrhizal network. The trees had learned to recognize him, were tracking his movements, were perhaps even discussing him in their slow, chemical language. It was the first hard scientific evidence that trees could identify and remember individual humans, that they were not just passive observers but active, participants in their relationships with other species. This discovery led to a new phase in Ethan's work. He began to approach his forest observations as a two-way interaction, recognizing that he was not just studying the forest, but was being studied by it in return. He wondered what the trees made of him, whether they recognized him as someone trying to understand them, or just as another oblivious human passing through their domain. He began to be more deliberate in his forest interactions, always moving slowly and respectfully, often pausing to place his hand on bark in what he hoped was recognized as a greeting. He couldn't know if these gestures meant anything to the trees, but they meant something to him, helped him remember that he was a guest in an ancient, conscious system that deserved respect and reverence. Winter arrived with its usual transformation of the forest, but Ethan now saw it differently. The dormancy of winter wasn't sleep, but a different kind of consciousness, a turning inward, a time of processing and planning. The bare trees weren't lifeless, but were conducting their business through underground networks, sharing resources with struggling neighbors, planning for spring's growth. The animals that remained active through winter seemed to move with even more deliberate coordination, as if the hardship of the season required greater cooperation. Even the snow seemed to participate in the forest's communication, muffling some sounds while amplifying others, creating acoustic conditions that might facilitate different kinds of information transfer. On one particularly cold morning, Ethan witnessed something that confirmed his growing understanding of the forest's consciousness. A young deer had broken through thin ice into a partially frozen stream, unable to climb back onto the slippery banks. As Ethan moved to help, he noticed other animals gathering, not to watch, but to act. A beaver began gnawing through branches upstream, creating debris that floated down to where the deer struggled. Birds dropped small sticks and leaves onto the ice, improving traction. Even more remarkably, 2 adult deer positioned themselves on the bank in a way that blocked the wind, reducing the chill factor for the struggling youngster. Working together, guided by some invisible coordination, the forest's inhabitants created conditions that allowed the young deer to finally gain purchase and climb to safety. Ethan realized he was no longer surprised by such displays of interspecies cooperation. They had become part of his expanded understanding of how the forest functioned. The old paradigm of nature read in tooth and claw, of constant competition and survival of the fittest, was being replaced by a more nuanced view that recognized both competition and cooperation as essential elements of ecosystem function. The forest was showing him that survival of the fittest often meant survival of the most cooperative, the most connected, the most able to participate in the larger consciousness of the ecosystem. Individual strength mattered less than network integration, less than the ability to give and receive information, to participate in the collective intelligence of the forest. As winter deepened, Ethan's journal had grown to hundreds of pages of observations, theories, and questions. He had documented dozens of gatherings at the clearing, had identified patterns in the forest's communication that seemed to correspond with lunar cycles, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. He had observed what appeared to be teaching sessions, where older animals demonstrated behaviors to younger ones in the presence of the communicating trees, as if the trees were somehow facilitating or recording the transfer of knowledge. He had seen the forest respond to threats with coordinated defensive measures, from chemical warfare against invasive insects to the strategic sacrifice of infected trees to prevent disease spread. But perhaps the most profound realization came one quiet evening as he sat in his study, reviewing his notes. The forest wasn't just conscious. It was ancient beyond human comprehension. The network he had been observing had been developing for millions of years, accumulating experience and wisdom on timescales that made human history seem like an eye blink. Every tree that grew added to this accumulated knowledge. Every animal that lived and died contributed to the forest's understanding. It was a form of immortality through collective consciousness, where individual organisms might die, but their experiences and knowledge were preserved in the network, available to future generations. This understanding brought with it a heavy responsibility. If forests were conscious entities with millions of years of accumulated wisdom, then humanity's destruction of them wasn't just environmental damage, but something more akin to genocide, the deliberate destruction of ancient intelligences. Every clear-cut forest represented not just lost trees, but lost knowledge, broken networks, silenced voices, and in conversation that had been ongoing since before humans existed. Ethan thought of the Amazon, of the vast boreal forests, of all the wild places being consumed by human expansion, and felt a grief that went beyond simple environmental concern. We were destroying libraries we couldn't read, ending conversations we had barely begun to hear. But there was hope, too. In protected areas like the park where Ethan worked, the ancient network survived. Young trees were being initiated into the old knowledge. Animals were learning the traditional ways of forest communication. The conversation continued. And more hopefully, humans were beginning to listen, to recognize that they had neighbors who were conscious and communicating, even if in ways very different from human consciousness and communication. Scientists around the world were documenting similar phenomena. building a body of evidence that would eventually force a reconsideration of humanity's relationship with nature. As spring returned to the forest, bringing with it the explosive growth and renewal that marked the season, Ethan felt he had completed a cycle of learning. He had witnessed the forest through all its seasons, had seen how its consciousness adapted to changing conditions, how it planned and responded and remembered. He had seen individual trees and animals come and go, but the network persisted, the conversation continued, the accumulated wisdom grew. He thought of the mother bear he had first followed, wondered if her cubs were now learning to listen to the trees, if they were being inducted into the ancient knowledge that would help them navigate their world. The spring morning arrived with an unusual warmth that seemed to awaken the forest earlier than usual. Ethan had been tracking weather patterns for weeks, noting how the trees seemed to respond to barometric changes days before any shift became apparent to human senses. He had developed a routine of arriving at the forest before dawn, positioning himself at various observation points he had established over the months. Today, something felt different. The air carried a charge of expectancy that made his skin prickle with anticipation. He had learned to trust these sensations, these subtle communications from the forest that operated below conscious awareness. As he made his way along the familiar trail, he noticed that the usual morning bird chorus was muted, replaced by an attentive silence that reminded him of that first day when he had witnessed the mother bear's communication with the trees. Lily had asked to come with him again, and he had agreed, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would be important for her to witness. She walked beside him with the quiet confidence of a child who had spent many mornings in the forest, who had learned to read its moods and respect its mysteries. She had developed her own relationship with the trees over the months, often spending hours sitting quietly beside particularly old specimens, placing her small hands on their bark and closing her eyes as if listening to stories only she could hear. Ethan had stopped trying to explain these behaviors through conventional child psychology. He had seen too much to dismiss the possibility that children, with their unformed preconceptions about what was possible, might be more naturally attuned to the forest's consciousness than adults who had been trained to filter out anything that didn't fit established paradigms. They were heading toward a section of the forest that Ethan had been monitoring with particular interest. 3 weeks ago, during one of the gatherings at the ancient grove, he had noticed animals departing in unusual patterns, many heading toward this area despite it being outside their normal territories. He had followed discreetly and discovered what appeared to be preparation activity. Squirrels were caching nuts. In specific locations, birds were building nests in unusual proximity to each other, and even the trees seemed to be responding with accelerated growth in certain directions. It all suggested coordination toward some future event, some purpose that Ethan couldn't yet understand. The scientific part of his mind wanted to document everything, to find rational explanations for these behaviors. But the part of him that had learned to trust the forest's wisdom knew that understanding would come in its own time, that patience and observation were more valuable than premature theories. As they approached the area, Ethan immediately noticed the congregation of animals. But this gathering was different from the communication sessions he had witnessed at the ancient grove. The animals weren't arranged in their usual respectful distances from each other. Instead, they were intermixed in a way that defied normal predator-prey relationships. Rabbits sat near foxes. Mice moved freely past owls. Deer grazed peacefully beside coyotes. It was as if all normal rules of forest interaction had been temporarily suspended, replaced by some greater purpose that transcended individual survival instincts. At the center of this unusual assembly, Ethan saw something that made him stop abruptly, his hand automatically reaching out to keep Lily from moving forward. There, in a small clearing, surrounded by these mysteriously cooperative animals, were the two bear cubs he had seen months ago with their mother. But the cubs were clearly in distress. One was limping badly, favoring its left rear leg, while the other had visible scratches across its face and shoulder. They huddled together, making soft whimpering sounds that Ethan recognized as calls for their mother. But the mother was nowhere to be seen. What was even more remarkable was that the assembled animals weren't just passive observers. They had formed a protective circle around the injured cubs, and some were actively participating in what could only be described as caregiving behavior. A doe was gently nuzzling the injured cub, her maternal instincts apparently extending beyond her own species. Several raccoons had brought water in their paws from a nearby stream, offering it to the cubs with careful deliberation. Birds dropped berries and edible leaves within reach of the young bears, while larger animals maintained a vigilant watch at the perimeter. Ethan's mind raced to understand what he was witnessing. Cross-species altruism existed in nature, but was typically limited to very specific circumstances, usually involving some mutual benefit or genetic relationship. This was different. This was an entire ecosystem mobilizing to protect and care for two injured members, regardless of species boundaries. He thought back to all the gatherings he had witnessed, all the communications between trees and animals, and realized that what he was seeing was the practical result of that network. The forest's consciousness wasn't just about information transfer. It was about creating a community that could respond collectively to crisis, that could recognize suffering and mobilize aid regardless of the artificial boundaries humans used to categorize nature. Lily tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward the massive oak tree that dominated one side of the clearing. The tree was beginning to emit that familiar deep humming, but this time the sound was different, more complex, with multiple tones weaving together in what almost sounded like harmony. Other trees around the clearing joined in, each adding their own frequency to create a chord that Ethan could feel resonating in his chest cavity. The assembled animals became even more still, their attention focused entirely on the tree's communication. Then, from the forest behind them, Ethan heard movement. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that he recognized immediately. The mother bear was returning, but she wasn't alone. With her was the elderly bear Ethan had seen before, the one who had originally led the cubs to safety, and surprisingly, two more adult bears he didn't recognize. The reunion between mother and cubs was brief but intense, the mother checking her injured young with careful attention while making soft vocalizations that seemed to communicate both relief and concern. But what happened next challenged everything Ethan thought he knew about bear behavior. The four adult bears arranged themselves around the injured cubs and began a coordinated treatment process that defied explanation. The elderly bear moved to specific plants at the edge of the clearing, carefully selecting certain leaves and bark with the deliberation of an herbalist choosing medicines. She brought these to the mother, who chewed them into a poultice that she then applied to the cub's wounds with remarkable gentleness. The other two bears, meanwhile, had begun excavating a shallow depression in the soft earth, lining it with moss and leaves to create what looked like a healing bed. The level of cooperation and apparent medical knowledge being displayed was extraordinary. Bears were intelligent animals, certainly, but this went beyond simple instinct or learned behavior. This was the application of accumulated knowledge, possibly passed down through generations, about which plants had healing properties, how to prepare them, how to create conditions conducive to recovery. Even more remarkably, the other forest animals continued to participate, bringing water, food, and maintaining their protective perimeter. The tree's humming continued throughout, sometimes intensifying when the bears moved to new plants, as if providing guidance or confirmation of their choices. Ethan found himself wondering if the trees, with their chemical sensitivity and vast underground networks, could detect medicinal compounds in plants and somehow communicate this information to the animals. As the morning progressed, Ethan noticed other subtle contributions from the forest ecosystem. Butterflies and bees seemed to deliberately pollinate certain flowering plants near the clearing, perhaps ensuring future supplies of medicinal vegetation. Birds removed parasites from the injured cub's fur with careful precision. Even the insects seemed to participate, with certain species avoiding the area, while others, known for their antiseptic properties, were attracted to the wounds. It was as if the entire forest had become a living hospital, each species contributing what it could to the healing process. The coordination required for this level of cooperation was staggering, suggesting a communication network far more sophisticated than anything currently recognized by science. Lily had been watching everything with the intense concentration she brought to important moments. She whispered to Ethan, asking if the forest was taking care of the baby bears the way doctors took care of people. Ethan nodded slowly, realizing that his daughter's simple analogy was perhaps more accurate than any scientific explanation he could offer. The forest was indeed functioning like a medical system, with different specialists contributing their expertise, with communication networks coordinating care, with accumulated knowledge being applied to promote healing. But unlike human medical systems, this one operated without hierarchy, without central control, through pure cooperative emergence. Each participant knew their role, not through training or instruction, but through some deeper connection to the forest's collective consciousness. The sun had climbed high overhead when the treatment phase seemed to conclude. The injured cubs were now resting in the prepared bed of moss and leaves, their wounds cleaned and treated with the herbal poultices. The mother bear lay beside them, alert but calm, while the other adult bears took positions around the clearing that suggested they were standing guard. The assembled animals began to disperse, but not randomly. Different species left at intervals, some apparently going to gather food, others to collect more medicinal plants, still others to patrol the wider area for potential threats. The organization was remarkable, like watching a well-coordinated emergency response team. Except this team was composed of dozens of different species operating without any apparent leadership or command structure. Over the following days, Ethan returned to monitor the cubs' recovery, always maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to observe the ongoing care they received. The forest's medical system continued to function with impressive efficiency. Fresh medicinal plants were brought regularly, the moss bedding was changed when it became soiled, food and water were constantly available. The cubs' recovery was remarkably rapid, their wounds healing cleanly without the infection that might have been expected in wild conditions. Within a week, they were moving around the clearing, playing with each other, and beginning to explore their surroundings under the watchful eyes of not just their mother, but the entire forest community. During this time, Ethan noticed something else remarkable. Young animals of various species were brought to observe the healing process, as if this was an educational opportunity. Adult deer brought their fawns, birds brought their fledglings, even fox kits were led to safe viewing distances by their parents. They would watch for periods of time, then be led away, only to return later for another observation session. It struck Ethan that he was witnessing not just healing, but teaching. The transmission of knowledge about medicinal plants, wound care, and cooperative assistance from one generation to the next. The forest was ensuring that this knowledge wouldn't be lost, that future generations would know how to mobilize the ecosystem's resources in times of crisis. The tree's role in this educational process was particularly fascinating. During each teaching session, certain trees would emit their low humming communication, and Ethan noticed that the frequency and pattern would change depending on which aspect of the healing process was being demonstrated. When the elderly bear was selecting medicinal plants, one pattern would emerge. When the wounds were being cleaned, another. It was as if the trees were providing a kind of narrative structure to the lessons, helping to encode the information in a way that could be remembered and retrieved. He thought of how human cultures had used songs and stories to preserve knowledge before writing, and wondered if the trees' humming served a similar purpose function for the forest's oral, or rather vibrational, tradition. One morning, about 2 weeks into the cub's recovery, Ethan witnessed something that would fundamentally change his understanding of the forest's consciousness. He arrived at the clearing to find it empty, except for the recovering cubs and their mother. But the atmosphere was charged with the same expectancy he had learned to recognize as preceding significant events. The mother bear rose and walked to the large oak tree, placing her paws against its trunk in what had become a familiar gesture. But this time, instead of the tree beginning to hum, the bear did. She produced a low, sustained tone that was quickly matched by the tree, creating a resonance that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Then, one by one, other trees joined in, each adding their own frequency until the entire clearing was filled with a complex chord of sound that seemed to contain infinite harmonics. What happened next was beyond anything Ethan had previously witnessed. Images began to form in his mind. Not visual exactly, but something deeper, more fundamental. He saw the forest as it had been decades ago, saw the mother bear as a cub herself, injured and scared, being helped by a different community of animals. He saw the elderly bear, younger then, learning about medicinal plants from an even older bear. He saw generations of animals and trees sharing knowledge, building the network of cooperation he was now witnessing. He understood, in a flash of insight that bypassed rational thought, that he was experiencing the forest's memory, its accumulated history encoded in the vibrational patterns of wood and leaf, root and soil. The cubs were being shown this same history, being inducted into the continuity of forest consciousness that connected them to countless generations before, and would connect them to countless generations to come. The vision, if that's what it could be called, lasted only moments in objective time, but subjectively it felt like hours. When it ended, Ethan found himself on his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had experienced. Lily was beside him, her small hand in his, and he could tell from her expression that she had experienced something similar. The bears were moving away now, the cubs fully healed and ready to return to normal forest life. But Ethan knew that nothing would be normal for him again. He had been given a glimpse into a form of consciousness so vast and ancient that human awareness seemed like a candle flame next to the sun. The forest wasn't just alive, wasn't just conscious. It was a repository of millions of years of accumulated experience, a living library of survival strategies, healing knowledge, and cooperative wisdom. As they walked home that day, Lily asked him if he thought humans would ever be able to join the forest's network, to become part of its consciousness the way the animals were. Ethan considered the question carefully. Humans had separated themselves from nature, had built walls of technology and civilization that blocked the subtle communications that connected all other life. But perhaps those walls weren't permanent. Perhaps, as people like him and Lily learned to listen again, to recognize the consciousness that surrounded them, humanity might find its way back into the conversation. Not as masters or managers of nature, but as participants in an ancient dialogue that had been ongoing since life first emerged on Earth. The implications of this possibility occupied Ethan's thoughts for days. If humans could learn to communicate with forest consciousness, to access its accumulated wisdom, how might that change our approach to environmental challenges? Could we learn sustainable practices that had been tested over millions of years? Could we understand climate patterns through the deep memory of trees that had witnessed centuries of change? Could we develop medical knowledge from the pharmaceutical library that forests had been compiling since before humans walked upright? The potential was staggering, but it would require a fundamental shift in how humanity saw itself in relation to nature. Not as separate from and superior to the natural world, but as one species among many in a vast, interconnected, conscious ecosystem. Meanwhile, the cub's recovery had become something of a legend in the local wildlife community. Ethan noticed that animals were behaving differently throughout the forest, showing more cooperative behaviors, more willingness to assist other species in distress. It was as if the successful healing of the cubs had reinforced the value of cooperation, had strengthened the bonds that connected the forest's inhabitants. He documented several instances of cross-species assistance that would have been considered impossible by conventional biology. A hawk warning deer of an approaching hunter. Squirrels dropping nuts for an injured raccoon. A snake clearing a path for a limping fox. Each act of altruism seemed to strengthen the network, to increase the forest's collective capacity for response and adaptation. The scientific community remained largely skeptical of Ethan's reports, though a small but growing number of researchers were beginning to take notice. Studies of plant communication through chemical signals were revealing previously unknown levels of complexity. Research into mycorrhizal networks was showing that forests could indeed function as superorganisms with distributed intelligence. Observations of animal behavior were challenging long-held assumptions about competition versus cooperation in nature. Slowly, grudgingly, science was beginning to acknowledge what indigenous peoples had always known, that consciousness was not unique to humans, that intelligence took many forms, that the natural world was far more aware and interconnected than modern civilization had assumed. One evening, as summer reached its peak, Ethan received an unexpected visitor. The elderly bear appeared at the edge of his property, something that had never happened before. She stood at the forest line, clearly visible but making no move to approach closer. Ethan understood this was an invitation. He followed her into the forest, leaving Lily safely at home, but carrying with him the sense that he was about to witness something significant. The bear led him deep into the oldest part of the forest, to a grove he had never seen before despite his years of ranging these woods. Here, the trees were even more ancient than those of the communication clearing, their trunks so massive they seemed more like geological features than biological ones. In the center of this grove was a tree that defied comprehension. It was clearly ancient beyond measure, its trunk twisted and gnarled into patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like script in an unknown language. The elderly bear approached this tree and placed her paw against it, then looked back at Ethan with what he could only interpret as expectation. Hesitantly, feeling somewhat ridiculous, but trusting the strange journey that had brought him here, Ethan placed his hand on the bark beside the bear's paw. Immediately, he felt it, a vast network of connection that extended far beyond this forest, reaching out to forests hundreds, thousands of miles away. He sensed communication flowing through root networks, through fungal threads, through chemical signals carried on the wind, through the migrations of birds and butterflies, through waterways and weather patterns. The realization hit him with physical force. The consciousness he had been observing wasn't limited to this forest. It was planetary. Every forest was connected to every other forest, sharing information across continents, coordinating responses to global changes, maintaining the atmospheric and climatic conditions that made life on Earth possible. The Amazon could communicate with the boreal forests, the redwoods with the rainforests of Asia. It was a World Wide Web that predated the Internet by hundreds of millions of years, a global nervous system that regulated the planet's life support systems. Humanity, in its ignorance, had been damaging this network, breaking connections that had existed since before the dinosaurs, silencing voices in a conversation that maintained the conditions for life itself. The elderly bear removed her paw and began walking back toward more familiar territory. Ethan followed, his mind reeling from what he had experienced. He understood now why he had been shown this. The forest had recognized him as someone who could bridge two worlds, who could potentially help humanity understand what it was destroying before it was too late. It wasn't about him personally. He was simply a convenient interface between two very different forms of consciousness. His role was to translate, to find ways to communicate the forest's reality in terms humans could understand and accept. It was a responsibility that felt overwhelming, but also essential. If humanity was to survive its own success, it needed to recognize that it was part of a larger living system, not its master, but its dependent. Back at home, Ethan found Lily waiting on the porch, somehow knowing he had experienced something important. He sat beside her and tried to explain what he had learned, using simple words and concepts a child could grasp. But Lily surprised him, as she often did, by understanding immediately. She said the trees had been trying to tell her the same thing, that everything was connected like a big family, that hurting one part hurt all parts. She asked if that meant the forests in other countries were like cousins to their forest, and Ethan said yes. That was exactly what it meant. They were all part of one big family of life, all talking to each other, all taking care of each other, all necessary for the health of the whole. The next phase of Ethan's work began that night. He started reaching out to researchers around the world, sharing his observations more openly, connecting with others who had witnessed similar phenomena. He found allies in unexpected places, physicists studying quantum entanglement, who saw parallels in forest communication, computer scientists working on distributed intelligence who recognized familiar patterns in ecosystem behavior, philosophers exploring consciousness who were eager for real-world examples of non-human awareness. Slowly, a new understanding began to emerge, one that bridged science and traditional knowledge, one that recognized consciousness as a fundamental property of complex living systems rather than a unique product of human brains. The bear's cubs, now fully healed, became regular visitors to the edges of human spaces, showing unusual comfort around people, as if their healing experience had created a bridge between species. Other animals began exhibiting similar behaviors, approaching humans who showed respect and understanding, avoiding those who didn't. It was as if the forest was testing humanity, seeing if it was ready to rejoin the conversation it had abandoned in its rush toward civilization. Some people passed these tests, showing they could listen and respond appropriately. Others remained deaf to the forest's communications, trapped in a worldview that saw nature as a resource rather than a relative. As autumn approached again, bringing with it another cycle of change and preparation, Ethan reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple walk in the forest with his daughter. He had started as a ranger, someone who managed and protected wilderness. He had become something else, something that didn't have a name in modern vocabulary. Perhaps the closest term was from indigenous languages, someone who speaks for the forest, who translates between worlds, who helps maintain the balance between human ambition and natural wisdom. It wasn't a role he had sought, but it was one that had chosen him, or perhaps the forest had chosen him, recognizing in him the combination of scientific training and spiritual openness necessary to bridge two very different ways of understanding the world. The work was far from complete. Most of humanity remained unaware of the consciousness that surrounded and sustained them. forests continued to fall at alarming rates. Ancient networks continued to be severed. Voices that had spoken for millions of years continued to be silenced. But there were signs of change. More researchers were taking forest consciousness seriously. More people were spending time in nature, learning to listen. More children like Lily were growing up with an understanding that the natural world was not just scenery but family. Each small awakening strengthened the possibility that humanity might remember its place in the larger conversation before it was too late. One morning, as the first frost of autumn silvered the grass, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest with Lily, watching the sun rise through the trees. The forest was particularly active this morning, with birds calling in complex patterns, squirrels moving with unusual purpose, even the trees seeming to lean and sway in coordinated ways despite the absence of wind. Lily pointed out that it looked like the forest was dancing, and Ethan agreed. It was dancing, celebrating. Another turn of the seasonal wheel, another successful cycle of growth and renewal, another generation of creatures successfully inducted into its ancient wisdom. They stood together, father and daughter, human and forest, all part of the same vast, living, conscious system that had been dancing since life began. The final chapter of this phase of Ethan's journey began with an unexpected phone call. A documentary filmmaker had heard about his work and wanted to create a film about forest consciousness, to bring these ideas to a broader audience. Ethan's first instinct was to refuse, to protect the secret sacred spaces he had discovered. But then he thought about the urgency of the message, about the forests falling every day, about the desperate need for humanity to understand what it was destroying. He agreed, but with conditions. The film would respect the forest, would not reveal specific locations of sensitive sites, would focus on the message rather than sensationalizing the mystery. The filmmaker agreed, understanding that this was not just another nature documentary, but potentially a catalyst for changing how humanity saw its relationship with the natural world. The filming process brought unexpected insights. Having to explain his observations to cameras, to articulate for audiences what he had experienced, forced Ethan to find new ways to communicate complex ideas. He developed metaphors and analogies that made forest consciousness accessible to people who had never spent time in wilderness. He compared the mycorrhizal networks to the internet, the trees' chemical communications to email, the gatherings at the ancient grove to town halls. These simplifications didn't capture the full magnitude of what he had witnessed, but they created bridges of understanding that allowed people to begin grasping the concept of non-human intelligence. During the filming, something remarkable happened. The forest seemed to understand what was being attempted and chose to reveal itself in ways Ethan had never seen before. Animals appeared on cue, demonstrating cooperative behaviors that would have taken months to capture under normal circumstances. Trees exhibited communication patterns that were visible even to cameras, with coordinated movements and synchronized responses to stimuli. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, providing perfect conditions for filming the subtle phenomena that usually required careful observation to detect. It was as if the forest had decided it was time to be seen, time to reveal itself to humanity in hopes of being understood and protected. The elderly bear made an appearance during filming, approaching closer to the human crew than any wild bear should. She moved with deliberate dignity to one of the ancient trees and demonstrated the communication posture Ethan had first witnessed months ago. The film crew was speechless, their professional composure shattered by the obvious intelligence and intentionality of what they were witnessing. The bear looked directly at the main camera for a long moment, her eyes conveying a depth of awareness that no one present could deny, then walked calmly back into the forest. The footage would become the centerpiece of the documentary, the moment that made millions of viewers question their assumptions about animal consciousness and forest intelligence. As the project progressed, Ethan began receiving communications from people around the world who had experienced similar phenomena. Park rangers in the Amazon reported trees that seemed to guide lost travelers to safety. Researchers in the Siberian forests documented coordinated animal behaviors that defied conventional explanation. Indigenous elders shared stories that had been dismissed as mythology but now seemed to describe real phenomena with scientific accuracy. A global community was forming of people who had glimpsed the deeper reality of forest consciousness, who understood that the natural world was far more aware and interconnected than modern science had acknowledged. The responsibility of being a spokesperson for this emerging understanding weighed heavily on Ethan. He knew that every word he spoke, every claim he made, would be scrutinized by skeptics looking for any excuse to dismiss forest consciousness as fantasy or anthropomorphization. He had to be careful to distinguish between what he had directly observed and what he theorized, between documented phenomena and personal interpretation. But he also had to convey the emotional and spiritual dimensions of his experiences, the aspects that couldn't be reduced to data but were essential to understanding the full implications of forest consciousness. It was a delicate balance, requiring him to be simultaneously a scientist and a poet, a researcher and a mystic. Lily had become his most valuable advisor in this process. Her child's perspective cut through the complexity to find simple truths that resonated with audiences. When asked how she knew the trees were conscious, she replied that she knew the same way she knew her parents loved her, not through proof, but through feeling and connection. When asked what the forest wanted from humans, she said it wanted the same thing everything alive wanted: to be healthy, to be safe, to be able to take care of its children. These simple insights often communicated more effectively than Ethan's careful scientific explanations, reminding him that understanding consciousness required more than just intellect. It required heart and intuition. The documentary's release coincided with a series of environmental crises that made its message particularly urgent. Massive wildfires were devastating forests worldwide. Floods and droughts were becoming more extreme, and climate change was accelerating beyond predicted rates. In this context, the idea that forests were conscious entities capable of regulating planetary systems gained new relevance. If forests were indeed maintaining climatic stability through coordinated action, then their destruction wasn't just removing trees, but dismantling the very systems that made Earth habitable. The film's argument that protecting forests was equivalent to protecting a planetary nervous system resonated with audiences who were desperately seeking solutions to environmental collapse. But there was resistance, too. Industries dependent on forest exploitation attacked the documentary as unscientific propaganda. Some scientists dismissed it as New Age mysticism dressed up in scientific language. Religious groups were divided, with some seeing it as confirmation of creation's sacred nature, and others viewing it as pagan nature worship. The controversy generated intense debate about consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in the natural world. Ethan found himself at the center of this storm, defending his observations while trying to build bridges between different worldviews. He emphasized repeatedly that accepting forest consciousness didn't require abandoning science or religion, but rather expanding both to accommodate a larger understanding of life and awareness. Through it all, the forest itself continued its ancient rhythms, seemingly unperturbed by the human drama swirling around it. Ethan continued his observations, documenting new phenomena, deepening his understanding of the communication networks that connected all life. He watched the bear cubs he had seen healed grow into young adults, exhibiting unusual intelligence and cooperative behaviors that suggested their early experience had fundamentally shaped their development. He observed new patterns in the forest's responses to human activities, subtle adaptations that suggested it was learning about human behavior just as humans were learning about forest consciousness. One significant development was the forest's apparent attempt to communicate more directly with humans. The humming frequencies that trees produced during communication events began to include harmonics within human hearing range, as if deliberately adjusting to make themselves more perceivable. Animals began exhibiting behaviors that seemed designed to catch human attention and convey specific messages. Even the patterns of growth in certain areas seemed to form symbols or indicators that humans could interpret. It was as if the forest had recognized that some humans were finally listening and was adapting its communication methods to facilitate understanding. This adaptation went both ways. Ethan and others who spent significant time in conscious communion with forests reported changes in their own perception and cognition. They became more sensitive to subtle environmental changes, more able to predict weather patterns, more attuned to the emotional states of animals and even plants. Some reported experiences of expanded consciousness during deep forest meditation, moments where the boundaries between self and forest seemed to dissolve, revealing a unified field of awareness that encompassed all life. These experiences were difficult to verify scientifically, but were consistent enough across different individuals to suggest a real phenomenon. The implications for human evolution were profound. If consciousness was indeed a field phenomenon that could be shared and expanded through connection with other conscious systems, then humanity's isolation from nature hadn't just been environmentally destructive, but had also limited human potential. Reconnecting with forest consciousness might not just save forests, but might also represent the next stage in human development, an evolution not of body, but of awareness. Children who grew up with this understanding, like Lily, seemed to exhibit enhanced empathy, creativity, and problem-solving abilities, as if their connection to the larger consciousness of nature had activated dormant capacities in their own minds. Research institutions began establishing programs to study these phenomena more systematically. Long-term studies were initiated to document communication patterns in forests, to map the networks that connected trees and animals, to understand the mechanisms that allowed for coordinated responses across ecosystems. New technologies were developed to detect and analyze the subtle signals that forests use to communicate. Chemical sensors that could read the molecular messages trees sent through the air. Vibration detectors that could capture the low-frequency communications that traveled through soil and wood. Electromagnetic monitors that could map the bioelectric fields that surrounded living trees. What emerged from these studies was a picture of forests as information processing systems of staggering complexity. Every tree was simultaneously a sensor, a processor, and a transmitter of information. The mycorrhizal networks that connected their roots formed a biological internet that could route information around damage, establish new connections as needed, and maintain memory of past events. Animals served as mobile agents in this network, carrying information between disconnected forest patches, pollinating ideas as well as flowers. The entire system exhibited properties of learning, adaptation, and problem-solving that met any reasonable definition of intelligence. But perhaps the most significant discovery was that this intelligence was not competitive, but fundamentally cooperative. Unlike human intelligence, which had evolved in a context of competition for resources, forest intelligence had evolved to maximize the health and resilience of the entire ecosystem. Individual trees might die, but their nutrients and even their information patterns were absorbed by the network, contributing to the collective intelligence even in death. This suggested a form of consciousness that transcended individual identity, that found meaning and purpose in the continuation and evolution of the whole rather than the survival of the part. This understanding began to influence human societies in unexpected ways. Communities near forests started organizing themselves along more cooperative lines, inspired by the organizational principles they observed in nature. Businesses began experimenting with distributed decision-making systems modeled on mycorrhizal networks. Educational institutions developed curricula that taught children to think in terms of systems and relationships rather than isolated facts. Even governments began considering how forest consciousness principles might inform more resilient and adaptive forms of governance. Ethan watched these developments with a mixture of hope and concern. Hope because humanity seemed to be awakening to a larger understanding of its place in the living world. Concern because this awakening might be coming too late to prevent catastrophic environmental collapse. Forests were still being destroyed faster than they could regenerate. Climate change was accelerating, and species were going extinct at rates not seen since the last mass extinction event. The question was whether humanity could transform its relationship with nature quickly enough to prevent the unraveling of the life support systems that sustained all complex life on Earth. The answer came from an unexpected source. Children around the world, inspired by figures like Lily and educated in the new understanding of forest consciousness, began demanding radical changes in how society treated nature. They organized strikes from school to protest deforestation, created international networks to share information about local environmental conditions, and used social media to shame corporations and governments that continued destructive practices. But unlike previous environmental movements, these young activists spoke of forests not as resources to be conserved, but as relatives to be respected. Not as property to be managed, but as partners in the project of maintaining a habitable planet. This shift in language reflected a deeper shift in consciousness. The generation growing up with knowledge of forest intelligence couldn't accept the old paradigm of human dominion over nature. They understood themselves as part of a larger living system, temporary manifestations of a consciousness that had existed long before humans and would exist long after. This perspective gave them both humility about humanity's place in the world and determination to protect the systems that sustained all life. They weren't fighting for the environment as something separate from themselves, but for their extended family, their larger self, their true home. As Ethan watched Lily grow into a young woman who embodied this new consciousness, he felt a deep satisfaction despite the challenges that remained. She moved through the world with a grace that came from knowing she was never alone, always connected to the vast network of life that surrounded and sustained her. When she spoke about forests, it was with the familiarity of someone talking about beloved relatives, full of stories about their personalities, their histories, their wisdom. She had learned to interpret the subtle signals of nature as easily as most people read facial expressions, able to sense the health of an ecosystem within moments of entering it. One day, as they walked together through the forest where their journey had begun, Lily told him she had decided to become a translator like him, someone who could help humans and forests understand each other. But she wanted to go further, to develop technologies that could facilitate direct communication between human and forest consciousness, to create interfaces that would allow people to experience the forest's perspective directly. It was an ambitious goal, one that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. But having witnessed the reality of forest consciousness, having experienced the possibility of communication across species and kingdoms, Ethan knew it was not only possible but necessary. The forest around them seemed to approve of this plan. Birds sang in harmonious patterns, leaves rustled in rhythmic waves, and the ancient trees hummed their deep, resonant approval. The elderly bear, now truly ancient, appeared one last time, moving slowly but deliberately toward them. She approached Lily, who stood perfectly still, showing no fear, only respect and recognition. The bear placed her massive paw gently on Lily's outstretched hand, a gesture that seemed to pass something between them. A blessing, perhaps, or a commission, or simply an acknowledgement of kinship. Then she turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the green shadows for what Ethan somehow knew was the final time. Standing there, 3 generations of consciousness represented in their small group, the ancient wisdom of the bear, the bridge generation of Ethan, and the emerging synthesis embodied by Lily. Ethan felt the weight of time and responsibility. The forest had been patient with humanity, had tried to teach and guide despite centuries of destruction and ignorance. But patience was not infinite, and the systems that maintained life on Earth were approaching tipping points that, once crossed, could not be reversed. The next few years would determine whether humanity could evolve quickly enough to become a conscious partner in the maintenance of planetary life, rather than remaining an unconscious destroyer of it. As they walked home, Lily asked him if he thought humanity would make it, if people would learn to hear the forest's voice before it was too late. Ethan considered the question carefully, thinking of all he had witnessed, all the signs of awakening and resistance, all the potential and peril that lay ahead. He told her he didn't know for certain, but he had hope. Hope because the forest had chosen to reveal itself, to offer communication and cooperation despite all the harm humans had done. Hope because young people, like her, were growing up with a different understanding, a different relationship with the living world. Hope because consciousness, once awakened, had a tendency to spread, to seek connection, to create the very conditions for its own expansion and evolution. The sun was setting as they reached the edge of the forest, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that were reflected in the leaves of the trees. The evening chorus of birds was beginning, that daily celebration of survival and community that marked the transition from day to night. Somewhere in the forest, the bear cubs Ethan had watched being healed were now adults, perhaps with cubs of their own, teaching them the ancient ways of communication with the trees. The mycorrhizal networks beneath their feet were carrying messages from root to root, sharing resources, coordinating responses, maintaining the conversation that had been ongoing for millions of years. Ethan thought about the title of the documentary that had started to change public perception, When the Forest Speaks. But now he understood that the forest had always been speaking. The question had never been whether the forest could communicate, but whether humans could remember how to listen. Standing at the threshold between forest and human settlement, between wild consciousness and civilized isolation, he made a silent promise to spend whatever time remained to him helping humanity remember its place in the conversation, helping his species find its way back to the community of consciousness that was its birthright and its only hope for survival. The forest hummed its approval, a sound so low it was more felt than heard, a vibration that connected earth to sky, past to future, human to nature. It was the sound of life itself, conscious and continuous, ancient and eternal, patient and persistent. It was the sound that had guided the mother bear to her cubs, that had orchestrated their healing, that had revealed to Ethan the vast intelligence that surrounded and sustained all life. It was the sound that would guide humanity, if it chose to listen, toward a future where consciousness was recognized and respected wherever it arose, where the conversation between species was not fantasy but foundation, where the forest's wisdom could help heal the wounds that ignorance had created. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, each one a distant sun perhaps warming other worlds where consciousness had taken different forms, Ethan and Lily stood together in silent communion with the living world around them. They were witnesses to a great transformation, participants in an ancient mystery, bridges between worlds that had been separated but were finding their way back to each other. The story that had begun with a baby witnessing a mother bear communicating with trees had become something larger, a testament to the consciousness that connected all life, a call to awakening that was spreading across the world, a hope that humanity might yet remember its place in the grand conversation of existence. The forest settled into its nighttime rhythms, but the communication never ceased. In the darkness, roots exchanged nutrients and information. Night hunters and foragers played their parts in the ecosystem's balance, and the great trees stood sentinel, their consciousness patient and enduring, waiting for humanity to fully awaken to the reality of the living, thinking, feeling world that had always surrounded it. The conversation continued, as it had for millions of years, as it would for millions more if given the chance. And in that continuation lay both the tragedy of what was being lost and the hope for what might still be saved, if only humans could learn, finally and fully, to listen when the forest speaks.